or I don't think I wanted them. I want the render files on the hard drive, don't I? I don't want the render files on the external hard drive, do I? Well, I was good at art, whatever that means, when I was in primary school and secondary school. So I got some attention for that, some approval for that. And then I was getting my degree in psychology, and I was in my last year, and I hadn't taken art classes because my mother had discouraged me from art. She said it was very competitive. So I'd gone into psychology instead. And then the last year, when I had most of my credits, I took an art class. I took two. And in one art class, there was a very dynamic teacher. And she said something that left a big impression on me. She said she moved 2,000 miles to get away from her mother. And at the time, I'd never had a teacher who was so kind of upfront about her own personal life, or the interplay back and forth between one's own life and one's own emotions and making art. And it made a huge impression on me. I thought, well, if art can be that, it's much more interesting than psychology. I liked my psychology teachers, and they were good people, but at that point, a lot of psychology was dissecting mice or rats or that kind of psychology. And I felt like, well, art was really what I thought psychology was going to be, but wasn't. So then I kept it up. I kept taking art classes.
And what sort of medium were you working in at the time?
Performance. I did some painting, but there's something for me about painting where, and I took, let's see, a while ago when I was at the Art Institute, I took a painting class in the summer because I could take it for free as a faculty member. And I had the same feeling then, which was that when you're painting, you see the brush in front of you. And that made me feel really self-conscious. Not when I was a kid and just painting for the fun of it, but later on when it was a question of, well, what is this brushstroke in relationship to abstract expressionism? Or what is this brushstroke in relationship to anything, any movement? And then that I found paralyzing. But performance and video were experimental and fairly new forms. And they weren't owned by men in the same way that traditional art forms were. So I felt like I could get lost in them. In a way, I didn't feel like I could get lost in painting or sculpture. So that was a good thing to do for me. And I'm glad I had teachers who encouraged me to do that. I also studied design for a year, and it seemed to me that a lot of times what people need, and what I needed, even though I couldn't have said that I needed it then, was I needed a teacher who knew that I wasn't in good enough shape to do anything other than incubate. I had John Baldessari in a class, and Sheila de Bretteville later on, and Sheila, it was a more intense program, but I still felt that she, as did Baldessari, that they allowed for students who really didn't know what they were, what they wanted to do. And particularly with Sheila, who may have been one of the most generous teachers I ever had, she gave me assignments to do based on Joseph Alber's color experiments that he did with his students. And, they were fairly mindless, and I just played a lot with color aid cuttings and made forms and shapes. And she said, well, that knowledge will stay with you for the rest of your life. I mean, there were other students who were doing much more advanced work. But I felt that, you know, those two teachers, for example, understood something that a lot of teachers, maybe I haven't either, which is that you push different students in different directions depending on what they tell you they're capable of. So that was a good experience for me. Even if I didn't do any work that I particularly loved that year, it kept me in.
That's interesting about incubation. I don't think there's any real, there doesn't seem to be any space for that at university. These days it seems to be quite like, there's a lot of commercial thought around everything that I'm doing at university. Like it's all about getting a job or getting some funding or, yeah, I mean, it obviously influenced you a lot. Can you say kind of a bit more about how it influenced you or how it influenced you further work? What did it draw you towards?
In some ways, I wish it had influenced me more. As a teacher, I wish it influenced me more because I feel like I wasn't able to do for students necessarily what my teachers did for me or those teachers. But what the correlative for me is a colleague of mine, Adrian Rifkin, has talked about when students don't speak, because he worked with a student who didn't say much for about a year, and the other tutors thought she should fail or whatever, and he said no. I think she's actually the smartest student in the group. And then the next year she figured out something that she wanted to say and started working really hard. And I thought it was the same thing, but in different language, having to do with giving people permission to figure out what they want to say at their own pace. But I do think, so what he said was that she didn't know what she wanted to say yet. What I felt was that I just needed to incubate, that I needed a safe place where I could be around other artists, where I could be exposed to ideas and to practices without the pressure of forcing myself to do something before I could or before I was ready to. But I do think that's lost. I think it's really difficult in universities, in research universities, to allow students to have downtime. I suppose the closest would be before art departments or before art schools were merged into universities, when they were still polytechnics, when maybe there was some atmosphere that was less oriented toward an ambitious theoretical theory project, where people could just get lost in colors or forms or art schools or movements and find their way at their own speed. In the States, to some extent, I associate it with the influence of continental philosophy on fine art practice. And it wasn't enough just to be an artist or have an artisanal approach. That would be, regressive. You had to have an idea. It had to be idea-based. It had to be located within a theoretical moment. And I'd say that was probably in the 70s and 80s. So one of the formative moments for me in the States was the Society for Photographic Education, for example, which used to be the domain of a kind of like all guys in photography doing Ansel Adams, kind of photography. And it was kind of infiltrated by photography students and people who were interested in having photography be something else other than a kind of artisanal approach. And there were huge issues and debates and huge revolutions within that organization. Arthur Rossler was one of the people who was kind of engaged in that argument about photography, which coincided with the question of, can photography be art? And you could say, well, maybe one of the ways to strengthen that argument is for it to have a theoretical component or an art historical component rather than just an artisanal component. I mean, those organizations like SP, they were really sexist. I mean, really sexist. And in the States, it's the College Art Association, which has an annual conference once a year, which is a big kind of job market. And that used to be the domain of very conservative art historians, mostly. And it's moved away from that to being a place where programs and conference panels and stuff are as much focused on artists. But there are people, I guess I would be one of them now, who would say, well, it's time to go back to art as people taught it in a polytechnic, which is a strange thing to say for me because I really wanted to do syllabi, I really wanted to have a theoretical component in the classes that I taught. So in a way, it's a big reversal for me to think otherwise. And it maybe has to do with my experience more recently at Leeds, where it seemed like art history and fine art just warred so much. And art historians didn't really understand art in some ways, art by living artists, and in some ways didn't want to. So, okay, if you can't think of art, something that shocked me when I moved here was with first year students, for example, you couldn't just show the work, students can't just show the work by itself, it has to be contextualized by a journal. And to me, that puts the burden on the artist to explain, as compared with the tutors to decipher. And I think you see that all the way through, which is that everything has to be contextualized, everything has to be explained, everything has to be framed, which makes it, in a way, really easy for the tutors, because they can read the journals and stuff. Okay, well, that's about this, or they can read the signage, or they can read the thesis. But it means that, in some ways, people aren't doing the work and taking the responsibility and the risks for interpretation. And that seems like a shame to me. Well, I think certainly the practice-based PhD, I think it does, and because it means that if you want to get your PhD, it means that there are certain risks you can't take, I think. It means you can't have an open-ended or contingent project if it means that the work, that the external examiner isn't willing to engage the work on the terms in which the art itself exists. So if something's ambiguous or open to interpretation, that might be the project. Ambiguity might be the project. Uncertainty might be the project. But if an external examiner thinks, well, it's not clear enough, then the student can come back and say, well, it's not that it's not clear enough, it's that you're too anxious about uncertainty to engage with it. You can't, and you think, wow, you can't. So I think it makes the artists more conservative at that point in their careers. I don't know, I felt that I had to be more conservative if I wanted to see my students get their PhDs. Well, it gave me the space to be incoherent in a safe environment. And then what happened next was I graduated, and I was still kind of like, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know how, I don't know how I'm going to pull this off. And then I had a friend, she's an artist, her name is Susan Mogul. And she said, well, don't. Less competition for me. Don't get it together. And that was one of the best things I could have heard. It was kind of like, no hand-holding, no this, no that, just, okay, so what? And it was great. And then the next thing I started to do was to go to look at work and to go to look at performances. That was in Los Angeles, and I felt that the community at that point was incredibly accepting and forgiving, that all you had to do was show up. All you had to do was go to performances, you know, have a drink afterward, and you could be part of the community. And then you saw the work, so it gave me more opportunities to think about how I'd want to frame my work as part of a conversation. Like, what did I think was missing? What did I think the prevailing issues were? What did I think I could add to that debate? I thought, well, women's art was very influential then, in a way, especially in the performance art scene in Los Angeles. Suzanne Lacey was doing a lot of work, Nancy Buchanan, Barbara Smith, Rachel Rosenthal. It was very dynamic. So I felt like I could see a lot of that work. Where I felt, and I think this had to do with other experiences I was having in my life, having to do with my family. And I thought, well, I haven't seen much work about alcoholism in the family. I mean, there's plenty of work about that now, but there really wasn't much then. And so I thought, well, I could add something about that. And I related that to, at the time I was bulimic, so I related that to kind of, generational addiction, or the way in which compulsive behavior can change from one generation to the next, but it's still a form of compulsion. And then later on, partly influenced by kind of art that people were doing that was about socialist ideas, or informed by socialism. I had a friend then named Fred Lonadier, and he said, what's interesting is that nobody's working with sports, and that sports is a language that most people in America speak. They speak the language of baseball, or they speak the language of, well, we'd say over here American football, or basketball, but artists aren't really touching it. And I thought, oh well, so maybe in a way, if I did a piece about baseball, for example, I could have a different audience, or maybe I could do something where I'd have a crossover audience. So in a way, it was kind of exploiting an area. I was very influenced by Carol Duncan's ideas about how public spaces are gendered. And she gave me a set of readings, and I looked at those and read those, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting to think that in many societies it's obvious that spaces are gendered, but in our society no one talks about it or no one thinks about it. So I thought, well, if sports is gendered male, is there a way that I could mess with that, or subvert it or infiltrate that? So it seemed like an opportunity to do work that hadn't been done quite before like that. I started off I did a performance about my family, and then people said, well, the writing is really the spine of the work, and so it would translate well into a video. So I adapted it for video, and that worked a lot better for me, because I think performance is extremely demanding emotionally. Whereas if it's in video, or if it's in time-based work that you can record and then you can put it on a DVD or whatever, and you can ship it out, and you don't have to be there, you don't have to go through the agony of remembering lines or performance anxiety. Once you've done the hard work of making meaning, then you can replicate that and send it out. So that appealed to me. Not exactly, no. In the radical feminist art programs that I was in, such as the one that Sheila de Bretteville pioneered at CalArts, such as the one that Chicago did at Fresno, those teachers were really looking for forms where women could do what they wanted to do without feeling obliged to honor the tradition of kind of patriarchal art making. So I had classes in video. For example, at CalArts in Sheila's program, we did a series of interviews with young women, and then to older women about menstruation. And that was all sort of, all the interviews and everything was all conducted by women in the design program. And a lot of people at that point, women, were also doing work in experimental film and reel-to-reel video along those lines. And there was, was some absolutely great work. Linda Montano's piece, Mitchell's Death. I don't know if you know about that. Montano had been a nun, and then she left the religious order, and she became a performance artist. And she did a piece about the husband that she'd had. Mitchell, she was still close to, but he died in an unfortunate gun accident. And the piece is just it's just a close-up of her face, but it's blurry in the beginning. And all she does is she tells the story of what happened and when she went to see the body. But it's done almost in a chant. But so the face starts out blurry, and then as the focus becomes clearer, you realize that she has acupuncture needles all over her face. And she just tells the story, but almost as a kind of chant. So it feels like a litany, it feels like a lamentation. And then at the end of the story of talking to Mitchell when she goes to see his body, then the end, it fades out. Or it doesn't fade out, it just goes blurry and almost into black. And it's just the simplest, most beautiful piece. So those kinds of works had a big influence, and they were done by women who, well, a lot of artists were interested in video before, when they could, it was cheap enough to work with the equipment, but not so precious that it was kind of like a big studio, or it made it possible to take risks, because you could go over the tape, or you could just experiment with not a lot invested in it, the project. For the most part, in a different way, not completely. Like in LA, for example, there was Paul McCarthy, who was doing some pretty messy, some pretty emotional performances and video pieces. But my memory, I have a really vivid memory of being at CalArts, and there was this kind of laboratory-like feeling in the women's courses of, they were kind of coupled together with talks about our family, study groups about what women had written. And it felt very much like a laboratory. There was like a huge sense of urgency and excitement about what was possible. And then I'd get through working, and then I'd go back to where I lived, and I'd walk past these video editing suites. And there were guys in the video editing suites, and they were all doing abstract things, just like, abstract designs. And at the time I thought, you losers, you just don't realize where the action is. That it's not with this kind of work that's a recycled, abstract expressionism. It's not in work that's formalist in a way that painters had already investigated. Now, in all honesty, decades later, I came around to sort of realize that a lot of that sort of materialist work was actually really interesting. So I guess in some ways, although there was a certain pluralist attitude in the sense of what you could make work about, in another way, there were certain things that I didn't value that later on I came to think as being quite profound. But at the time, I just thought, well, don't these guys have an idea? You know, don't they have something to say? In the 80s, I'd moved to New York, so I was exploring different. New York had a really different feel, much more, in some ways I'd say sophisticated, but much more interested in sort of work that also incorporated a socialist or a socialist critique of capitalism. The feminism, so a lot of New Yorkers saw the feminist movement, feminist art movement in California as being kind of cultural feminism, not a feminism that was a critique of other systems of power or abuse. So New York was good for me in the sense that it gave me an opportunity to rethink what feminism is. I don't know if you know what a cultural feminist is. It was a phrase that was used a lot, which is that if you were just interested in advancing the cause of women for your own class. So a cultural feminist would be someone who maybe just wanted it to be possible for there to be more shows, like say art shows for white middle class women, you know, in a way that was fairly oblivious to other issues for women from different classes or ethnicities or races or you know, people from other countries. It was pretty, so that was, you didn't want to be a cultural feminist if you were at all interested in power, because it would just meant that you were only interested in power for yourself or your friends. It didn't mean you were actually interested in having an analysis of how power operated from system to system. So I was exposed to more of that in New York than I had been in California. Well, it wasn't that time. I mean, I think a lot of women were just exploring without kind of taking into consideration, I mean, maybe, you know, white middle class women had more opportunities to, and more resources to language, you know, in the beginning. So it took a while. There's a really good article in the New Yorker about a feminist theorist called Shulamith Firestone. And I guess I'm sort of jumping, but the thing that was interesting is that when women first came to power and first, you know, started kind of leading the conversation around feminism, around art, the ones who had been the leaders were often trashed. So it got to be extremely complicated. So women who started like a cultural institution for women in Los Angeles, Sheila de Redfield, Judy Chicago, and Arlene Raven. So there's this, you know, great big building called the Women's Building, and, you know, it could be many things to many people. There was a gallery, there were many programs, you know, there was a school, an accredited college for women there. I taught in it. But it broke down a lot over factions. So it represented, you know, a time that was very difficult. I'd say there was an organization called the Fat Underground or Fat Liberation or something like that. And they decided to boycott the Women's Building because the Coca-Cola machine had Diet Coke. So that was oppressing women. Or I was just reading recently about Shulamith Firestone, and she was part of a brigade in New York. She wrote a book called The Dialectics of Sex, which was hugely influential for a lot of women. She was in a brigade, kind of like an activist group that was named after two feminist pioneers. And the other women in that collective were angry that that core group had the name of two feminist pioneers, while the other core groups had the name of one feminist. So they agreed to abolish that, they voted to abolish that group, and they didn't want any of those women leading. So there's this kind of betrayal of many women, of other women. And, you know, a lot of, so in the first there was this sort of like incredible enthusiasm and everybody was equal, and it was this kind of just delirious excitement. And then it's almost like this kind of emotional displacement started taking place, which is like, well, what's it really about? If you have a leader, or are we all leaders, or what happens if somebody gets more attention than other people? What happens if someone becomes a public spokesperson? How do you share it then? How do you share the kind of resources then? And a lot of people were really hurt. A lot of people were really injured by that. So it was a complicated time, both within the feminist art world and within the movements. So, for example, there was the civil rights movement, and then a lot of women who had been leaders in that felt like the people were treating them in a very sexist way, and they didn't want to just be part of a ladies' society that made tea for guys. So then they started their own groups, and then within those groups, then it was complicated. It's a very complicated time. It's Sheryl Sandberg, who has a book out called Leaning In. She's a chief operating officer of Facebook. And she has a book about that women, they can't give up, they need to stay in. And she uses as an anecdote a mother who's trying to get her daughter to be more polite. And then she's thinking, but it's great that the daughter's bossy, because that's going to come in really handy. And it seems to, and I've been following a lot of the discourse in The Guardian or The Times or The Independent about that book, but also about when women do and don't support each other. And I think that there are still some pretty basic and very lethal forms of competition, and that a lot of the discourse is much less than civil. And I still get the impression that a lot of people like to see women go at it. A lot of people like to see women have catfights or disagree with each other. And I still think the environment is profoundly sexist. Profoundly sexist. And, I mean, for example, I was reading about how the government's considering, or there are some people who say that white working class men should be considered a minority because working class guys aren't going to universities and colleges the way women are. And it's a real problem, and something that needs to be a special attention directed to that. And in a way I think, yeah, for sure I understand that, because women have been taught to socialize, women have been taught to accommodate. So I think in some ways women are much better prepared for the labor market now, where the strengths that are being sought aren't necessarily physical strength, but intellectual suppleness, intellectual flexibility, and social skills. And a lot of young boys aren't being encouraged to be accommodating, aren't being encouraged to listen. And I think it is a crisis for young men, and I often did feel that I saw that in my classes. On the other hand, if it's a preponderance of women students, say, in the undergraduate level in fine art programs, but it isn't a preponderance of women professors in fine art, what happens? Why is it that, why aren't those women students being encouraged? And it still feels to me as if a lot of teachers don't know how to listen to women students. They don't know how to hear what the women students are saying or trying to say. And I think this thing that's also true for guys who have been socialized to feel like they're the master of the universe, and what they say is universal as compared with women, and what they say isn't universal, it's specific. I mean, I think there are a lot of really serious issues, but it requires some nuanced thought. So if white working class guys are, suddenly a minority, what about the women students who still aren't being listened to in one way or another? I think a lot of times it's really subtle, really subtle. I mean, I can give an example of what I saw recently in relationship to a student who had a kind of Middle Eastern sort of last name and slightly dark skin, where some of the students in his critiques said that his work was sinister. His work wasn't, in my way of thinking, his work wasn't sinister. It was unconscious racism. They were just projecting, something onto him that they couldn't say, in a more literal form. And I think that's an example of how I see it kind of circulating and operating, not only with this student, but with women still. So I do think there's still a lot of work to do. Well, I think it's difficult because people think, oh, I'm not sexist. No one's sexist now. No one, that's over, that those days are over. Those days of extreme stuff are over. But I don't think they are. I mean, it was just a few years ago when, I'd see things that I thought, I can't believe this is still going on. Or the attraction of a young student toward an older male professor. The kind of allure of a male professor for young women students. I think that's still, to me, it seems like that still operates quite a bit. In some ways, it's a more complicated time in terms of the possible forms of existence that gender and non-gendered bodies can take. But I don't think you have to look very hard to see evidence of discrimination. And it seems in some ways that it's more difficult for women to find a language for that. So say, maybe for me when I was growing up, maybe it was more obvious, but it seemed more possible for me to find support for things that seemed not obvious, and then I could say, oh, well, yeah, it is actually obvious, and there's a language for that, and there are witnesses. There are, people who can recognize this. It seems now maybe it's more difficult for young women to find, to feel recognized for what they're experiencing. When I was in class, sometimes when guys would talk a lot, I would change the subject to menstruation, or to PMSing, to being premenstrual, just as an opportunity to get women to talk about that and to have the guys recede. Even here, even at a research university, I remember one day when there weren't any guys who showed up for a workshop, and it was all women, and how much the tenor of the group changed when it was just women students, and how much freer it seemed that the women were able to be in terms of being aggressive or funny, or, well, particularly aggressive. And it was remarkable, and they noticed it too. So what happened, when the guys weren't there? No one was saying anything obviously sexist to them. Nobody was doing anything macho. And yet it still seemed that, maybe you could say the same thing if none of the women turned up and it were a male teacher. Maybe the guys would have been different, and that doesn't mean anything except that you're more comfortable in some ways around people of your own sex. But given that we live in a very gendered society, I tend to kind of want to think about that. Is it just more comfortable, or is there something else operating, especially if it's students? What can they do in a single-sex setting that they can't do when it's co-ed, and why? It depends. A lot of times it's an image, or sometimes it's a phrase. Sometimes it's, I mean, like with Judith Snow, it may have just been that simple, quiet scene that she sent to me as a QuickTime video, the threat of her cancer having metastasized. But there was something about the image that was really beautiful to me. It just didn't go away. And I thought, I'd like to do something with that. With something that I'm working on related to, I'm not sure what to do about this because it's sort of personal in a way. I think, well, there's more at stake within my family. Because when I did the work about my parents' alcoholism was after they died. So I was excommunicated from the rest of my family for a while, but I wasn't living with what my parents were going to think of it because they were dead. So that freed me up in a lot of ways. But I've been doing some writing, phototext work about being a stepmother, because it seems to me that that's not a very nuanced conversation. It's just the Wicked Witch of the East kind of bad stepmother. And I understand that. I do understand that. So I thought, well, I could contribute something here. Maybe I could make the conversation a little bit more nuanced. I don't mean in an overly ambitious way, but just in the sense of where you think of, where is there an opening? Where is there something, what needs to be said? There's something here that needs to be said. There's a need, which is that a lot of women who are stepmothers aren't getting the support that they need from their husbands. Or in blended families. And the husbands can't, I understand why the husbands can't give the support, but it makes the women in those situations extremely lonely. And they have to understand what everybody else is feeling, but no one understands what they're feeling. And I thought, well, I could do something about that. And then I thought, on another level, because I was talking with a friend about it, what does it mean about me? What are my issues in that situation related to my relationship with my mother? And so I thought, well, maybe if I did work about that, not as therapy, but maybe since something seems so still unknown to me about my relationship with my mother, maybe I could think about it in terms of my own ambivalence about being a stepmother and being jealous of my stepchildren's mothers. I never wanted to have children, and every time I dreamt about having children, I always dreamt that I was either in prison or that I killed them. I went through a couple of periods where I sort of wanted kids, but I never really felt like I wanted to have kids. But then when I saw the power of the mother in relationship to my husband's children, it wasn't that it made me want to have children. It made me wonder something about, it was a real crisis for me in my own sense of where I feel powerful. Because let's say, maybe I feel powerful as an artist sometimes, but within that family unit, I don't have that, if they're not artists and they're not part of the art world, then I don't have that voice. So who am I to those people? And so I started just using pictures of my husband's mother's house when it was being emptied out after she died, as a way to kind of write about everybody's relationship to each other, but from the point of view of the only person who actually is kind of outside, as a step person, as a way of kind of thinking about the absence or the presence of absence in the emptied out home. So we'll see where it goes.
And is that kind of is it quite familiar, the process that you go through each time? Is it kind of something triggers and you can't get it out of your head, and then you start to think about what needs to be said about it? And that.
Yeah. Well, that I sort of got to some extent from Saul LeWitt, because he wrote about art and how if you have a good idea, there's almost nothing you can do to fuck it up. But if you have a bad idea, there's almost nothing you can do to make it right. And that one of the things, I think it was a guy, he wasn't my teacher, but he was a big influence on me, Terry Allen, an artist, who said, he used to model, was a nude model in some of his classes. And I remember him telling the students that, stick with the ideas that don't go away. Stick with the ideas and then see what you hate, because there's so much energy in what you hate. And think about making work. Not to kind of articulate what you hate, but what that source, and that can propel you forward in terms of being something that animates the work. So those were sorts of things. I think Solowit did say something about stuff that's in the unconscious that doesn't go away, like ideas that stay there.